So last week I talked about how you don't often hear added elevenths in major chords. And I went into this whole discussion about how that correlates to major pentatonic scales, and it was all pretty impractical, which I pointed out then. However, that got me thinking about how and why you might add elevenths to major harmonies. It's not a sound I tend to gravitate towards when I'm writing, and I think that's partially because it's a little awkward to play on the guitar, at least in a voicing that I find satisfying. But I always find it helpful to briefly step away from the guitar to wrap my head around the mechanics of how something might work. So let's do that first, and we'll look at how it will sit on the guitar later. And the chord of the day is A11. What is an A11 chord? First of all, any chord that is named with just a root note and a number is assumed to be a dominant functioning chord. The exception to this would be a sixth chord like A6. That's not usually going to function like a dominant. Let's just say the number has to be an odd number to keep it simple. Anyway, the dominant chord is the 5 chord of whatever key you're in. The 5 chord is a tense harmony that is expected to resolve to the 1 chord. So think like A7. A7 is the 5 chord in the key of D, or D minor. A11 is just an A7 with a couple extra notes in it, but at its core, it's still going to function like an A7. So what makes up an A7, first of all? A dominant 7th chord contains a root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, and minor 7th. If A is our root, then our notes are A, C sharp, E, and G. When this resolves, the dissonant tritone interval between C sharp and G will move a half step inward to D and F sharp, which are the root and 3rd of the 1 chord, D major. The A will probably go down a 5th to D. Then we'll probably hear an A somewhere in the D major chord, so there, I guess. Alright, so that is a basic, simple resolution of an A7. How do we turn A7 into A11? We would need a 9th, first of all. By default, it would be a major 9th, so B. A major 9th is just a major 2nd plus an octave, so think a whole step above the root and then move it up there. Then we need a perfect 11th. This is a perfect 4th plus an octave, so that would be D. Now we have an A11. When this resolves, the bottom 4 notes in the stack are going to do the same thing. Nothing changes by adding extra notes. When you stack up big chords in thirds like this, the function of the chord is determined by the bottom 3 or 4 notes. Anything above that, so 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, is just color. It doesn't change the function of the chord. That being said, those added color tones will still tend to behave a certain way when the rest of the chord resolves. A 9th added to a dominant 7th chord will tend to resolve down to the 5th of the 1 chord. So here, B would go down to A. The 11th, D, in this case, is a little more interesting though. D is the chord the A7 is trying to resolve to. And here is a D added to the A7. When you add a perfect 11th to a dominant chord, it anticipates the resolution of the rest of the chord. When the chord resolves, that high D stays right where it is. That's a sound you've heard before. It's an extremely bright resolution. There's a sort of poetic quality to it as well, like the end is in sight before the conflict is over. Not only that, but adding a 9th and 11th to a dominant chord makes it extra dissonant. But that's okay, because the dominant chord is supposed to be dissonant. Layering in more dissonance just adds to the tension. And just so I don't contradict myself, if you're ever going to add a perfect 11th to a major harmony, it's almost always going to be added to a dominant chord instead of like a major 7th chord. A major 7th chord is usually considered a restful harmony. Adding an 11th to that would introduce unnecessary dissonance. You don't always have to add 11ths to dominant chords. In fact, you shouldn't always do that. This effect should be saved for big climactic moments or if there's a poetic link to the lyrics. Okay, so that's mechanically how a dominant 11th chord would work. How do you play these on the guitar? It's a little tricky because the guitar is not laid out in a way that makes these stacked thirds piano voicings possible, especially big extended ones like this. And even if you shuffle voices around, you don't have enough fingers to play all the notes. So you have to cut notes out. The first note to go is always the 5th. The 5th contains no information about the quality of the chord, so ditch it. I talked about this in an old video if you want to know more about that. I would probably get rid of the 9th too, considering it's a dominant chord at its core, and our added color tones are the 9th and 11th. The 11th is probably the one to keep if it's an 11th chord we're meant to be playing. So that leaves the root, 3rd, 7th, and 11th. You could do this. There's my root, 7th, 3rd, and 11th. If played this way, I'd probably resolve it here. The D stays right where it is. The tritone resolves as it should. And then the A comes up to D. Alternatively, you could keep the 9th and ditch the root of the A11. In a real world situation where you have a bass player, you don't really need to play the root. I could do it up here. Here's the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 11th. Actually, because I'm playing an A11, I could just put the open A underneath it. A proper resolution would go like this. Tritone resolves. 9th goes down, becoming the 5th of the 1 chord, and the 11th stays right where it is. And those shapes are all movable, of course. So there you go. I hope that gave a little insight into how to use dominant 11th chords. Currently, I have a handful of openings for new private Zoom students. If that's of interest to you, feel free to reach out. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.